Okay, so welcome. It's going to be three of us as your hosts today. I'm William. I'm going to be doing a lot of the talking in the beginning. Then I'm going to hand stuff over to Jason and Alex. Jason will be showing us a little demo of 2.9 and hopefully an upgrade. Sorry, 2.10 and an upgrade from 2.9 to 2.10. So we'll watch a live upgrade. And then Alex will be here to answer all of the hard questions. So I will take the easy questions, and then the hard ones will be for him. So thank you all for joining. It's great to see this. I do have a commercial. It's the first time we've ever done this, but we're doing this as Buoyant, which is the company that created Linkerd. I have a commercial advertisement here, which is we actually have what I think is a super cool hosted dashboard for Linkerd called Buoyant Cloud. Free accounts. It's in early access right now. So if you go to buoyant.io/cloud, you can connect Linkerd to it and get hosted metrics and all sorts of other cool stuff. So if you're in 2.10, you don't even necessarily have to run the Prometheus stuff, on your own systems. You can offload all of that to us. So if you do get a moment, please try it out, buoyant.io/cloud, and give me feedback. I would love to hear what you think about this. I get a lot of users so far, but it's still early and a lot of stuff to build. Okay, so that's our commercial announcement. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to, this is a technical webinar about 2.10, so I'm going to talk a little bit about who is the intended audience here. I'm going to give a little overview of 2.10. I'm going to talk about some of the upgrade steps, and that's kind of the big thing I wanted to get to in this webinar, because it's not a trivial upgrade process. For some people, it will not be trivial. In the past, we've been able to do pretty seamless upgrades from 2.7 to 2.8 and 2.8 to 2.9 with some caveats that move from 2.9 to 2.10. For some people will be very easy, for others will be a little complicated, so I'll talk about that. And then, like I said, Jason will be presenting a demo and we'll do some Q&A. So if that sounds good to you, then stay tuned, and if it doesn't sound good to you, then just leave now, I guess, because this is what we're doing. Okay, so who is this presentation for? So this is a technical presentation. We're going to go into all the gory details. It's really aimed at our, what we call our partners, which are system integrators and other folks around the world who add Linkerd to the system of their clients. And of course, it's also for any end user of Linkerd, especially if they are thinking about 2.10. This is not going to be a generic service mesh overview. It's not going to be a generic Linkerd introduction. So Olivier, I know you said you know nothing about Linkerd and you're here to be convinced. I'm actually not going to do a whole lot of convincing, but if you are attending KubeCon EU in another month and a half or whenever it is, we'll be doing an overview and a state of Linkerd there that will be a lot more about convincing you to use Linkerd. But please stick around and hopefully you'll pick up some good stuff. Basically, I am going to assume that you have a pretty good understanding of Linkerd for this webinar. But if you're familiar with Istio, you'll be able to follow along, I think. It's not going to be totally crazy. If you do not know what a service mesh is, then this is not the place for you right now. we got to educate you in other ways first. Okay, so with all that aside, let's talk about 2.10. So this is our 10th major release, believe it or not, of the 2.x branch. So 2.0 was way back in whatever it was, early 2019, 2018. I don't remember. It was released about 2 weeks ago, and two big themes to this release. First is around extensibility. So we have this idea of extensions that I'm going to talk a lot about. And then the second is around filling in some of the gaps in 2.9, especially when it came to the ability of the mesh to provide features for all classes of traffic. So we'll talk a lot about opaque ports. Of course, like always, tons of improvements and bug fixes. We had over 50 contributors in this release, so thank you if you were a contributor. Official announcement blog post, of course, is up on the blog with lots of extra commentary about this. So let's talk about extensions. This is a big one. Extensions are opt-in components that will run as part of the control plane. By default, there's going to be 3 built-in extensions, and then you are also able to add third-party extensions, and I'll talk about both of those. So the built-in extensions, number one, we have one called Viz that captures Grafana, Prometheus, the dashboard, tap components, basically everything you need for observability is all in that extension. There's another extension around Jaeger, and then there's a third extension around multi-cluster. So if you remember in 2.9 and earlier, Viz was shipped by default. Multi-cluster, which we added in 2.8, was installed through kind of this ad hoc mechanism for, Linkerd multi-cluster install. And then Jaeger, we had some extra docs around how to add the span collector and the UI. So we've basically unified all that into the same model called extensions. And then, the other big implication here is that the Viz components are no longer installed by default. So if you do Linkerd install, on the CLI, or you install just the default Helm chart, you get a minimalist control plane that is just enough to power a service mesh, but does not have any of the metrics functionality in it. So if you are running your own metric stack, you're using bring your own Prometheus or whatever it is, that stuff will all continue to work, and you don't even necessarily have to install the Viz components. If you're using Buoyant Cloud and you don't want to install Prometheus, and you can just install the Buoyant Cloud extension. If you want the metric stack, then you install it, and everything will basically work as it did before, with one or two exceptions, especially around the CLI. We've changed the CLI commands a little bit to fit into this extension model. So, Linkerd dashboard now says, hey, this is a deprecated command. You have to run Linkerd Viz dashboard. Okay. Hopefully this makes sense so far. Just catching up on comments. Robert says, better to go minimal with the ability to build on it. Yeah, thanks. I think so too. So that default install, is now around 200 megs. And we all know that Prometheus is kind of the difficult thing to operate in the default install anyways. So now it's easier to not have that in your stack. Okay, so here's a diagram. I actually think this is not, it's not quite correct. There's actually 5 components, and this thing called public API is actually just called controller. And there's a service profile validator component in here, but roughly approximate. We have a much smaller control plane. The data plane, of course, is the Linkerd 2 proxy that we all know and love. And that part is mostly the same, although, of course, with lots of improvements. Costa says documentation needs some updates for this. I would definitely like to hear more about that, because the thing that I'm not talking about here, but that we put a lot of work into, was branching the documentation. So we actually have 2.10 docs separate from 2.9 docs. If you've been on the website recently, still some improvements in how that documentation branching is handled to come. But I thought we did a pretty reasonable job of documenting 2.10. So if we missed something, please let us know, because I do want to get those docs right. Docs are just as much of the product, a part of the product, as the code is, especially for super technical things. Okay, so then, and then just to give you a sense of what things look like with the Viz extension, for example, and I'm going to talk more about this in the next few slides. The Viz extension has all those components that, used to be part of the default control plane, and they're now in a separate namespace called Linkerd-Viz. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, I need to take a 3-second pause here for everyone to think through the implications. Okay, so I think I talked a little bit about this, but extensions are also extensible. So now we have a very nice mechanism for you to add kind of integrations into Linkerd. Extensions are just Kubernetes controllers and operators and whatever, with a little bit of a wrapper around them, mostly to make them fit into the CLI. And then they also have the ability to add inject time to set flags on the proxy. So if you need to enable certain features in the proxy, then extensions can do that as well. So for example, to install the Viz extension, you're doing Linkerd Viz install pipe kubectl apply -f dash, right? Just like you would do with Linkerd install. And then Linkerd check knows which extensions are installed, and it knows about the binaries on your system, and it'll call the appropriate check. So if you do Linkerd check and you have Viz installed, it will call Linkerd Viz check by default, and then the Viz check CLI will do whatever it needs to do. And that works for third-party extensions. Actually, I think that wasn't 100% accurate. I think the Linkerd Viz stuff is still all built into the default CLI. But for third-party extensions, the point is it works. So if you want to add a foo extension to Linkerd, you would create a binary called linkerd-foo. You would put it in your path, and then linkerd space foo space whatever will call that linkerd foo binary if it exists. It'll pass arguments to it, and linkerd check if it installs, if linkerd foo then installs a extension, a namespace, with its extension components in it. Linkerd will know that it is installed, and we'll be able to call, when you do Linkerd check, we'll be able to call Linkerd foo check and so on. So, the first third-party extension is this Buoyant Cloud one. So, here, you can see we install, you run this, if you want to install the Buoyant Cloud extension, you run this install thing, it puts a binary in your path, and now you have the same CLI. So Mateus, great question. That is the one example I have, is like the one I'm trying to convince you to use. But it's pretty easy to do this, and I think most of that is open source. It was about to be open sourced anyways, so you can see how we did it. But it's really not a lot of work. And I would love to see extensions, and I suspect we'll have a whole bunch of these coming up for things like ingress, and possibly egress, and like all the other kind of bits and pieces that you want to have in your system, that you want to have coordinated and kind of configured alongside Linkerd, but that are not necessarily part of Linkerd's core value prop. Okay, so that's extensions. We're going to go through the kind of installation implications of extensions in a bit, but that's kind of the feature overview. But first, I want to talk about opaque ports. So if you remember the two themes, extensions was the theme of extensibility, modularity. Opaque ports is in the category of filling in the gaps. So if you have been running Linkerd in production, you're probably very familiar with skip ports, which is our mechanism for handling, in 2.9 and earlier, the only mechanism we really had for handling weird, the technical term is weird traffic, right? It's traffic that the protocol detection code doesn't work on, basically, right? So protocol detection, part of the reason why Linkerd is zero config or almost zero config is because when you pass traffic through it, it detects what type of traffic that is, detects the protocol, and then it handles things automatically. So you don't have to annotate stuff ahead of time. But that works for most common things, but there are some cases where it starts breaking down. The reason it breaks down is because the way protocol detection works is it waits for the client to send some number of bytes, and then after it has enough data to determine the protocol, it says, okay, this is now an HTTP request. So that works fine for HTTP. Doesn't work for things where the server speaks first. So the client establishes a connection, doesn't say anything, and the server speaks. It also doesn't work for things that pre-establish connections. It doesn't work for, with cases where the client doesn't send enough bytes, in an early enough time frame. So there's all sorts of like corner cases where it doesn't work. So 2.9 and earlier, you skip ports and basically said, hey, for this port, just avoid the proxy entirely. So you would just bypass the proxy. It wouldn't even go through there. We would the way skip ports works. So it writes in like an IP tables rule that says, hey, all traffic goes through the proxy, all traffic to this pod, to and from this pod goes through the proxy, except for this like thing that we've excluded. So in 2.10, we've introduced this idea of opaque ports, which basically says, hey, put the traffic through the proxy, but just disable protocol detection. And then we made one other change, which is in 2.9 and earlier, the way that protocol detection would fail is it would wait for 10 seconds for there to be enough data to make a decision. And then if it couldn't detect the protocol, it would refuse the connection. 2.10 and afterwards, we fail open rather than failing closed. So after that 10-second timeout, we just treat it as a TCP connection and we continue. So the failure case in 2.10 hopefully is a little better. I mean, it sucks to have a 10-second connect delay, right? And that probably breaks a bunch of things, but at least we accept the connection in the end. Okay, so let's talk about what that means in a little more detail. So, the reason why we did this is because skip ports is really not a great solution, right? You want this traffic to go through the proxy because you want the proxy to be able to do things like MTLS and to report metrics, even if they're TCP metrics, right? You want everything going through the proxy as much as possible. So opaque ports now give us the ability to do that. And then the change that kind of gets a little complicated when it comes to upgrade time is that we have replaced the skip ports list. There's a default list of ports that would automatically be skip ports. We've replaced that with opaque ports. So, for example, if you were running SMTP, if you were on port 25 or port 587 in 2.9, that would automatically bypass the proxy. I guess probably a more common example is MySQL. Let's say MySQL because people actually run their own MySQL servers. So in 2.9, we would automatically bypass that traffic. In 2.10, we will mark it as opaque ports, and assuming you're using the default port for MySQL, that we will go through the proxy. And so now you have things, as part of this upgrade, you have traffic that's going through the proxy that you didn't have before, right? And so that's good, but it probably has some implications. In fact, it definitely has some implications when it comes to upgrade time. So we'll talk about that very shortly, but let me finish with the feature wrap up. So the other kind of fill in the gaps feature was for multi-cluster. In 2.9 and earlier, we were only able to do multi-cluster, which is like cross-cluster communication. We were only able to do that for HTTP traffic. In 2.10, we can now do that for all TCP traffic. So you can do your failures, failure of scenarios, failover with MySQL or whatever now. Upgraded the default TLS to 1.3, some new commands and endpoints. We changed the place where images are hosted. There were a set of weird incompatibility issues between 2.8 and 2.9 proxies for certain HTTP1 connections, which were really difficult to track down, but I think we finally tracked them down in 2.9.4, and that fix has been rolled in 2.10, and lots more stuff. I think we actually fixed Postgres handling entirely. I don't know. We're still trying to figure that out, but I think we may have fixed that. Okay, so that's the big scoop for 2.10. The next section here is going to be around some of the upgrade process. But I'll give you a moment to catch your breath. I know that was a lot of content. Okay, let's talk about upgrading. So we wrote a very comprehensive upgrade notice, and you should read it. And basically what I'm going to tell you here is also in that doc. So, you can either read what I wrote, or you can listen to what I said, or you can do both. 3 big things to be aware of when you're upgrading. The first is what version of Linkerd are you upgrading from? The second is, the removal of the viz components as part of the default control plane install. And then the third, which is probably the most nuanced, is the repercussions of opaque ports, and especially the change from default skip ports to default opaque ports. So let's walk through each of those in turn. If you are upgrading from 2.9.4, the latest 2.9 release, which basically just work. If you are upgrading from 2.9.0 through 3, then there's something you have to be aware of, which is if you got to that release, so if you got to that 2.9.x release by upgrading from an earlier release and you used the -- prune flag, then we messed something up. Alex broke something. I don't know if it was Alex, probably. And you have to use the Linkerd repair command before you can upgrade. Otherwise, you won't be able to upgrade. Actually, I think Alex probably fixed it. I don't know. So sorry about that. There, if you install 2.9.0 through 3 just on a clean cluster, then you shouldn't need to do that. It's only if you upgraded to that release and use the -- prune flag. And then 2.8 and earlier, I don't know. I mean, it might just work. Untested. So, test. Or, what should work is basically upgrading to 2.9.4 and then going to 2.10. But you may be able to skip it. We just haven't tested that. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's factor one. Factor two in upgrading is removal of the viz component. We talked about this as part of extensions. When you upgrade, all of those control plane components are going to be removed from your cluster by default. And if you want them back, you need to install the viz extension. And of course, some of the CLI commands have changed as part of that. If you're using Helm charts, we've moved, stuff into each extension has its own Helm chart, and then the values have moved. And for this viz stuff have moved into the Helm values. So, you'll have to just spend a little time, thinking through the implications of moving. If you have a highly customized Helm chart, you have to figure out where all that stuff goes. Okay, and then the third one, point 3 in the upgrade list is changes in the default port handling. As we talked about, the change from the skip ports list to opaque ports means that you're now going to have new traffic, very likely to have new traffic through the proxy that wasn't going through it before. We outline all of this in the upgrade notes. So I encourage you to read through that, because probably it's hard to absorb when I'm talking, when I'm running through it. But if the short story is, if you have SMTP or MySQL or Postgres or Memcache traffic to an off-cluster destination, so like you are making a call to an off-cluster MySQL database, you are going to need to change your config to mark that as a skip port. So you are actually going to have to change something. I apologize for that. It was the only way we could do this and remain sane. If you have client-initiated TLS, and that call happens at startup, TLS is now going through the proxy by default rather than skipping the proxy by default. So that means you are now going to be in this weird race condition that Kubernetes has oh so lovingly provided for us, and that may one day be solved. But basically, that call is going to go through the proxy, and the proxy is not ready, the call is going to fail. And if your application depends on that call working for startup, then like your application is going to get restarted a couple times until the proxy is finally ready to handle it. So that's only for calls that happen at startup and that the application requires to succeed. So kind of a weird case, but it's one that we encountered, so we're enumerating it. And then, of course, if you have an existing skip ports configuration, you may want to update your configuration and get the traffic through the proxy so that you get metrics and MTLS if the destination is within the cluster. Just like, I guess I should have said this in the first section, just like with just like with skip ports, opaque ports, those annotations can be set at the namespace, at the workload, and I think at the service level. I think service is new at 2.10. So if you didn't get all that, don't worry. It's all in the upgrade doc, and which point to then this upgrading guide that we wrote. But just know, especially if you have off-cluster calls to SMTP, MySQL, Postgres, Memcache, or if you have startup calls to third parties, off-cluster using HTTPS, you may have to change something. Okay. Oh, I talked about this. I should have waited for this slide. Yeah. So, any connection that happens at startup is going to go through the proxy. Any TLS connection is now going to go through the proxy in 2.10. And it's not going to work unless the proxy is available. There's this long sidecar KEP that, you can, if you want to read into Kubernetes history, you may actually be familiar with it. If you've been using service meshes for a while, there's not a short-term solution. For this, we have a tool called Linkerd await, which you can use to, to basically force the container to wait until the proxy is ready. You can fix your app so that it retries in the presence of network failure. Probably a good idea, but not always feasible. You can just ignore the problem and just deal with a couple of application restarts. Or you could, add a skip ports config and say, hey, this traffic's not going through the proxy at all. So you got a couple ways to handle that. Mateus asks, what about init containers making off-cluster TLS calls? That is what I consider to be a hard question, and therefore I defer that to Alan.
Yeah, I can answer that. It depends on the init container ordering, right? So Linkerd installs a init container which configures all the IP table rules that intercept the traffic going in and out of the pod. So if your init container runs after the Linkerd init container, but before the regular containers, the Linkerd proxy won't be available, and so that's not going to work. On the other hand, if the ordering is the other way around and your init container runs first, then it'll run kind of normally before we start doing anything with the IP tables, and it'll just kind of work as normal. So it's dependent on the init container ordering.
Thank you, Alex. Mateus, I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, then leave a frowny face. All right, let's move on. Oh gosh, that was it. Okay, so all right. I have now walked you through 2.10 kind of big ticket features, through some of the upgrade implications. And at this point, Jason is going to give us a little demo, I think. You ready for this, Jason? Are you able to do this? All right, we're going to try a little demo of an upgrade from 2.9 to 2.10. So I'll hand it over to you, Jason.
All right, awesome. Mateus is going to have another question here in a second, but I'm going to go ahead and share screens while we're getting started. Screen one. Which one's this? That looks like the right one.
Right, Mateus asks, is it possible to append Linkerd's init container after the existing one? Alex, over to you.
Yeah, the hard questions. I don't know. I'd have to check on this. So I believe that in a Kubernetes manifest, in like a pod spec or whatever, the init containers are listed in a specific order. I don't know if you just use Linkerd inject, for example. I'm not sure what order the Linkerd container will be put in, but failing that going in the right order, you should be able to kind of manually reorder your init containers to be the order you want. But I'm not sure what the default behavior is. I'd have to check.
All right, so with that, I'm going to go pop over to the demo. So what I'm doing today is just going to be upgrading Linkerd from 2.9.4 to 2.10. So I'm following the steps that we see in the upgrade notice guide, or in the upgrade guide. Pardon me. And so let's kick off. Can everyone see my terminal all right? Awesome. So what I've got here is a Kubernetes cluster running locally. I've got the Linkerd dashboard up. I've got all of my pods being listed here on the right, and I'm going to run some commands in the top left. So let's just pop over and check out the Linkerd dashboard. So here I've got my Linkerd dashboard running. I can view, oops, I don't have it running. Hold on. Second try. Here I've got my Linkerd dashboard running. I've got the Linkerd install here. I can go into that namespace, take a look at what's going on. I've got an ingress controller that has been connected into the mesh, so I can see traffic flowing in. I've got an application running inside Kubernetes. That's the Books app that some of y'all may be familiar with. But we can get a sense of how that app looks if we go into the Books app namespace. So I've got a nice view of, and this is, what is this graph called again? The term, this is a service map graph?
Yeah, like the topology graph is usually what I call it.
Graph. There we go. So we've got our topology graph. I can see the traffic, from the web app to books to authors, but my MySQL traffic is just being skipped. So I've got no sense of what's happening here. I can see the rest of my environment. Great, that's nice. If I scroll down here in my dashboard, I see at the very bottom a little notice saying that I'm running 2.9.4 and there's a newer version available. So let's go ahead and get that fixed. So just kick off, run the Linkerd version command. Right now I'm running the 2.9.4 and my server is on 2.9.4 as well. I can run my Linkerd check to validate that I'm healthy before I go do my work. It's pretty content, but it's upset at me because I'm out of date once again. So I'm getting these notifications kind of all over the place. So just following the steps right there in the doc, I'm going to start off just running a Linkerd install. So this is going to update the local CLI that I have. Tells me that I'm good to go. Pull up my new version, right? And I see that I've upgraded my client. So I'll start off, right? I'm just going to go ahead and run the Linkerd install command and prune any components with this label. And while I do that, I can go pull up my Books app, and I see that, can title, add a new article. It's awesome. And that was written weirdly by, let me turn this off. So I've got a little refresher going. That was written by Ursula Le Guin. And there are 12 pages in that book, so it's a short one. Great, cool, go home. Right, we've got our books. And all this has happened while the upgrade's going on, and there haven't been any issues. I can see on the right side here that I've got a bunch of pods getting terminated. Right, go through, after we run that one upgrade command, we have to do it again with an additional set of pruning. And here I'm just using a tool that types out stuff for me so that I don't mistype this big block of text in front of a bunch of folks. So once again, right, run the prune command, and we've got, some more stuff happening with my control plane. Now my Linkerd dashboard is not going to be as happy as the rest of this was, because my dashboard components are gone, right? We've had them removed as we did this upgrade, but my app still works, so that's good enough for now. We can run Linkerd check, right? We see that we're good to go, right? The components have finished going on, but obviously there's no control plane. There's no like dashboard components being added. So now we've got our first extension. So I'm going to take the Linkerd CLI command, run Linkerd viz install. I can quit out of here. Run Linkerd viz install, which will install the new dashboard. Great. Rerun the check now. So I can, so I've got the Linkerd check command, which I can run, which will check all the components, or I can just run the checks by the various extensions, right, which William talked about earlier as we were going through this. And again, right, my application is up, running. I haven't degraded anything that I currently had in the environment. Let me see if there's any questions in the chat. Init install process how? Not totally sure what that question is referring to. Alex, are you tracking on this?
So I think the question is about configuring resource limits and requests for the control plane during install. There are Helm values that you can set if you're installing with Helm that'll configure that, or if you're doing an install with the CLI, you can use the --set flag to set those Helm values that way as well. I can link to the docs once I find exactly where it is.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. All right, so what I've got now is I've got my application. I've got my application installed, or sorry, I've got Linkerd upgraded. I've got Linkerd viz installed. Right, we see there's a new namespace over here on the right called Linkerd viz, which has all the components that we're used to seeing in the dashboard. I can run now the Linkerd viz dashboard command to pop that open. Right, and we still see the environment. We're able to get more traffic, but now I'm going to want to upgrade the proxies as well. Right, so inside my Books app environment, we're going to just roll all the deployments so they get the latest version of the proxy.
Are we going to see the MySQL traffic pop up as part of this?
Yes, thank you for spoiling my reveal.
But we don't see it now, right? In the dashboard,
Right.
there's no MySQL.
Right.
I didn't mean to spoil it. Sorry. I just wanted to point out that there's no MySQL up our sleeve because of reports.
So this is where we start here, and give it a refresh. There we go. Now we've got traffic. So we're now able to catch that TCP traffic for our MySQL connection. So same graph that we had before, right, where we've got the view of the application, but now additionally the MySQL traffic is part of our mesh and is not just being skipped over.
Ooh.
So you can see it's a fairly quick process to run through the install. We can run some other commands. We can look at how so the CLI commands that you're hopefully used to with Linkerd around. Thanks a lot, Robert. That was really nice. So the things you're used to seeing, like in terms of like Linkerd tap or top or those views, those are now in Linkerd Viz, right? So let's just take a quick break here. So if we do Linkerd Viz -- help, right? So a lot of commands like edges, routes, stat, top, tap, those have now moved into Linkerd Viz. So you'll need that extension to make them work. And yeah, that's kind of all we have as far as a demo. Last thing, just because I don't want to ever miss a chance to plug it. If you are looking to ask more questions or talk to folks or have follow-up conversations about what we're doing, please join us on slack.linkerd.io. Get an invite to join our Slack community, and we'd love to hear from you there. And so I'll stop sharing with that.
That was great. So Jason, did you really just demonstrate a live upgrade from 2.9 to 2.10 with the application running the entire time?
I did, yeah.
That's amazing. How much would this service mesh cost? $1 million? $2 million?
Just under that it's entirely free.
Oh my gosh, that's just incredible. Okay, great. So I think, I have like one slide left, which is basically a giant slide that says questions, which I'll put up just so that our horrible faces get a little smaller. But that's the end of the demo. That's the end of like the what you need to know about upgrades. And what questions do you have? I have a question for Alex, actually, which is when Jason showed that dashboard for 2.10 and you saw MySQL in there, there was like a success rate in there. What is that success rate for MySQL?
I must have missed it. So MySQL is TCP traffic, right? So I would not expect there to be a success rate there at all.
Okay, it was 100%, which I guess sounds good, but yeah, all right, yeah, we'll have to look at what that thing is. All right, BK Lau asks, when is 2.11? Oh gosh, we just delivered 2.10. You already want another release? You don't even know what's in it. So I can kind of half answer that. I think we're probably, if you look at our cadence, probably around 4 months in between major releases. 2.11 is going to mostly be focused on what we're calling policy, which is a big bucket of features and probably will span a couple different releases. But the general idea is right now Linkerd says yes to every connection and every request. Under certain circumstances, you might want to say no. You might want to say no, that's, service A is not allowed to talk to service B right now. So how do we parameterize that? How do we capture that? And how do we do that in a way that's efficient? That's going to be the topic of 2.11, but I would expect, a couple months from now. Is there anything you want to add to that, Alex?
Nope, nothing specific.
It's going to be amazing. All right, next question from Vibov is sorry, is there a reason to use different namespaces for all the new installs? I think that's for like the extension. So, you know, we used to have Linkerd and Linkerd-multicluster. Now we have Linkerd-viz. So that sounds like a question for Alex. Why are we using all these namespaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kubernetes just kind of makes it easy to do this, just to kind of keep things organized. You've got just the Linkerd core control plane in its own namespace, and then each of these extensions in their own. It just, I mean, there's not a strong technical reason. It just keeps things better organized.
All right. It says, prefer to see all Linkerd and related components in one namespace, easy to manage. Yeah. I mean, it would be nice if Kubernetes had hierarchical namespaces and we could get the best of both worlds. But yeah, I guess we got to pick one or the other. And I think we take advantage of the namespace stuff too, where we annotate, like we know which namespaces are Linkerd namespaces with an annotation or a label. Okay, Rio says, are there plans to move to OpenTelemetry instead of OpenCensus for tracing and maybe metrics?
I can answer that one.
Yeah.
The answer is kind of yes. So the open tracing, OpenTelemetry, OpenCensus landscape is just very, at least it was when I last looked at it, very frothy. Things were changing a lot. There were a lot of deprecations going on. The API we're using right now, which is OpenCensus, is last I checked slated to become the OpenTelemetry API. So we'll definitely kind of move in that direction as things become more stable, but we're just waiting for that to happen.
Rio, do you have like a strong requirement around that, or is it just a question? And also, PR is welcome. OpenTelemetry is V1. All right. Submit a PR. I don't think we're against it, right? Like we want to do whatever is the, standard, I guess. Michael asks, if you upgraded from 2.8 to 2.9.2 using Helm, will you need to Linkerd repair before upgrading to 2.10? What's the relationship between Helm and like that prune flag?
Yeah, so if you go through the Helm, if you use Helm for your installs, then you don't need to worry about repair. Helm when you're using Helm, you're kind of managing your own configuration in terms of, your values file. So that's kind of up to you. You don't need to worry about repair.
So the issue was with --prune, we like accidentally deleted some resource that we needed for upgrades. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. But if you're going through the Helm path, that doesn't apply to you.
Yeah. So Michael, you should be good to go. Girish asks, can we see the network flow between app and proxy when using multi-cluster? I don't think we have a diagram in these slides. We might have one in the multi-cluster docs. If you want to look in that, look for the Linkerd multi-cluster docs, Girish, and you might see something. Basically, it's like, there's a gateway on the receiving side, on like the destination cluster side, and beyond that gateway, which also is meshed, I believe, and beyond that, it's all proxy to proxy, kind of like the same path you would see within a cluster. Correct me if I'm wrong, Alex.
No, that sounds right.
All right, and Rio says we've implemented open tracing very early, but we need to start upgrading. It'd be nice to have Linkerd natively pass around the tracing context and report spans using the OpenTelemetry spec. Yeah, I think we're open to it. All right, any other questions? Are William Morgan and Jason Morgan brothers? Oh, that's really awkward. He's my son, my wayward son. No, there's no relationship that I'm aware of between the two of us. But good question. Rio says, please don't grow Linkerd much larger in scope than it is now. Auth might be nice, but not much more than that. Okay. Great. I'd like to do less work rather than more work. But thank you. I appreciate that, Rio.
Yeah, I think that's always been a guiding principle of Linkerd, to do as little as possible.
As opposed to those other meshes. All right, good. Everyone's chiming in. All right, let's give it 120 more seconds for more questions. And if that's it, then we'll wrap things up a little bit early. Is everyone able to convince your friends, clients, bosses, and partners to use Linkerd? Is there anything that you want from us? Alex is here. He does the code. He types the code. Number one feature request for Alex to implement. All right. BK Lau says, I moved my boss away from Istio. Thank you. Appreciate that. Darius says that Jason and I look equally young. Oh my gosh, that's very flattering. For me, not for Jason. Yeah, I put a little grease on the camera lens. All right. Well, I think any book. Oh, is there a book for Linkerd? Gosh, I don't want to write one. Alex, you want to write one? Jason,
There's a run.
Yeah, there is a run book. Oh, that's true. Actually, I should mention that. So we have a production run book on Buoyant. Unfortunately and embarrassingly, it's not up to date for 2.10. So it really we need to fix that, but has a bunch of our advice for how to run Linkerd in production. So it's meant as a complement or a supplement to the docs. The docs have all the details. This is more like, here's our opinion and here's what we've seen. As Buoyant, helping everyone, or helping lots of organizations as we have adopt Linkerd in production. So it's things like how many what resource allocation should I do, and like what alerts should I set up, and things like that. So please check out the Linkerd production runbook if you have a moment. Thank you for the link, Jason. Rio says write a book, I think, for other layers of management so that proxy doesn't take the blame immediately when something goes wrong. Well, honestly, not to get back to the commercial message, but part of what I want to do with Buoyant Cloud is give you a dashboard that you can then show your boss, like, hey, look, this thing's green, and it's the application that's having the issues here. Because I know that is something that happens again and again when you install the service mesh. That's the first thing that gets blamed. We've known that since like Linkerd 0.9 in 2015 or whatever. We've seen that pattern over and over again. So I do want to make this defensible for you. All right, but let's wrap it up here a little bit early. But thank you all for attending. Really appreciate that. This was our first ever Buoyant Linkerd webinar. So really appreciate you partaking in this experiment with us. Like Jason said, find us in the Slack, slack.linkerd.io. And we'd love to chat with you there. And thank you again. Thanks to Jason for a great demo. And thanks, Alex, for answering all the questions.
Thank you.